As you saw there on the video, the subject of the third panel is digital reality of mass media, to be or not to be. And our moderator for this session is a dear friend, as someone I worked with from my days at Al Jazeera English. He's the managing director of the popular TV show, The Doha Debates. Please warmly welcome Mr. Amjad Atallah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, especially after lunch. And I especially want to thank the Eurasian Media Forum for inviting us and for having this excellent event. Special thanks to Dr. Dariga Nazarbayeva for hosting us. I want to also thank the people of Kazakhstan. I think everybody has been so generous and hospitable and warm since we've arrived, and the mayor gave a beautiful welcome this morning to us. Almaty is a beautiful city, so it's wonderful to be here. Now, our topic is the digital reality of mass media, to be or not to be. Now, that question has actually come up in the first two sessions. So if you were here for the first two sessions, you realize that this actually runs through everything. It runs through questions of globalization, it runs through questions of consumption, and we're going to take it on head on. Fortunately, we have a fantastic panel of journalists who I'm going to introduce, and as I introduce them, I'm going to ask them to come up and join us on stage, and I'm going to introduce them alphabetically. So I'm going to first introduce Alexander Aksayutis, who's a journalist, broadcaster, and editor in Kazakhstan. And I think everybody here knows him. He currently heads the New Salem social media company, which is engaged in the production of video content for social media networks. He previously worked on different TV channels in Kazakhstan and helped set up the country's first 24-hour channel and served in the office of the president. And Natalia Antelava, former foreign correspondent for the BBC, who left the BBC to co-found Coda Story, an award-winning nonprofit newsroom that specializes in context-driven thematic coverage. And then Dr. Ivo Burum, a television writer, director, and executive producer, and a specialist on mobile journalism, or what he calls Mojo. A pioneer of the user-generated style of production in Australia, Ivo has spent decades empowering citizens with storytelling skills to produce their own stories for inclusion in self-shot television series. He's an author, and he coordinates the media industries at Trobe University and works with ARIJ and the Global Investigative Journalism Network, training journalists to Mojo. I like saying that. Next, I want to introduce Boguslaw Chrabota, an editor of Poland's leading newspaper, Republic Daily News, and I'm going to try to pronounce it, Rzeczpospolita. He began his journalist career writing in the Polish dissident press. He later worked for Polish state television in the news department and helped set up Poland's first commercial television station. He is a frequent commentator on political and economic issues for Polish and international publications. And in our conversations, we actually found out that our family members immigrated to the same industrial steel town in the United States in the last century. So I'm going to be surprised if they actually know each other. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Zahera Harb, an author and senior lecturer in international journalism at the City University of London, a trustee board member of the Ethical Journalism Network, a former member of the UK broadcast regulator Ofcom's Content Board, and a former broadcast journalist and presenter for local and international media organizations in her native country of Lebanon. And last but not least, I want to introduce Mikhail Zygar, a Russian journalist and best-selling author. He's a former editor-in-chief of the only Russian independent news TV channel, Dozhd. He founded the creative studio Future History, inventing new genres and ways of narration. Its Project 1917 documentary dramatizes daily events of 100 years ago, which by itself is a fascinating idea. The way we're going to run this is I'm going to try to have it as conversational as possible, because we've spoken and everybody here has brilliant ideas, and I want to give them as much opportunity as possible to discuss these ideas. But first, I wanted to ask all of you a question, and ask you to briefly respond to it. There's been a lot of, you did notice that 2 or 3 of the questions in the first actually about social media and journalism, and whether journalism could survive social media was how some of the questions were already framed. And the title of this topic, of this panel, uses a Shakespearean expression, to be or not to be. And what I wanted to ask is if you agreed with the premise. Do you think that this is an existential moment for journalism, where the transition, what's changed in technology and what's changed in social media is actually a mortal threat to traditional forms of journalism? Or is this simply a way station, a transition point? The difference of getting introduced to radio for the first time and then getting introduced to television for the first time. Journalists have always had to adapt and change. Is this just another moment where we have to adapt and change? Or is there something deeper happening here? Is there something that's more threatening to the very core of journalism? And so with that, I'm going to start by asking Zahera to start and give us her opinions.
Thank you. I don't believe we are actually living an existential moment. What I believe is that we are facing challenges, and journalism as an institution, as an independent institution, is facing challenges. Journalism integrity is under attack when we are labeled as the enemy of the people. It's the large amount of information that is been disseminated out there and is used, like social media and new media is used as a platform for that, is trying to undermine journalism trust and credibility. And that's where I think our challenge as journalists come, is how we work together in order to regain what we believe as scholars and journalists is the precious commodity of journalism, and that is trust. And we also believe that the term fake news, which we don't like to use, so we use the term disinformation, lies, fabrication, is a political term that has been coined to undermine journalism trust and to undermine our integrity as journalists. And I think the most important challenge that we face now is the idea of refinding our role as journalists in society, and how we make sure that we go back to the core values and principles of why have we joined this profession, and what is it that we journalists do in order to help develop and inform our societies.
Thank you. Alexander, I'd like to go to you.
Well, let's start from the very start, when we had some petroglyphs. First of all, we had some petroglyphs when the papyrus came around, when the newspapers came around, and radio, followed by television. Now we ending up having the social networks, internet platforms. I don't think that we should be treating it as some sort of a breaking point. It's just a new step in the evolution of journalism. And looking at social networks as a challenge for the journalist, I don't think is the right way to do. Because if before 10 years ago, as a television journalism, I would have to spend half of the day to put a piece of news on the air. Now I can do it in real time using social networks, using the video platforms. Therefore, I do not see any conflict. And the question to be or not to be, I believe it's not very relevant, because thanks God, all of the progressive outlets and journalists are using the technologies for their benefit, to their benefit, and they have lots of subscribers. It will be getting even better. I don't see any problem. As for the previous speaker, she said that that's a challenge when it comes to misinformation and fact-checking. I think that misinformation has always existed. This is not a new thing to us. Remember, going back to history, how many times we've heard the announcement during the war actions that there were like announcements of victories several times, and then after fact-checking, there was no victories. So it's nothing special. I think that internet communications enable us to transmit this information much quicker. That's why people get scared. It has always been with us. It will always be there. However, the value of journalists is getting even higher because the value of communications is getting high as well. So the person creating the content is increasing his or her value. So the content creator is the utmost value, and I think it's growing through the new technologies.
Thank you. Actually, that's I think one of the things you hear a lot in the United States is journalists asking themselves, do our problems predate the social media and predate the technological changes that are happening, which is more maybe a challenge to the business model than it is to the idea of journalism, which is, I think, some of what you were saying. Natalia, I'd like to go to you next and hear what you think.
Right. I don't think it's an existential crisis. I think it's a crisis, and I think journalism is facing challenges like it's never faced before, but it also faced challenges like never before when radio was introduced or television was introduced and so on. I also think that in many ways journalism got a slap. The digital world, the digital era gave journalism a slap that we, as an industry, very much deserved. And it hit sort of three core areas. It hit, that then undermined the very existence of newsrooms. It's the revenue models are broken, the audience relationship is broken, and the trust is broken. I tend to think that all of this is a very healthy process because I think the revenue models should have been broken because that's what led the revenue models and then insane VC investment into companies that would have never brought the kind of profits that they were expecting to bring, and they lowered the standards in order to bring profits. That's partially what caused the deterioration in trust that people have in journalism. And when it comes to the audiences, I think as journalists, we're now being forced, we've been forced to come down from the high horse, and we are being forced to do something that we don't like to do. We don't like to think about people who read and listen to our stories. We want to do stories that we want to do. But I think it's becoming very clear that the only way to succeed, because one thing that happened is that I think the digital era has made our consumers much more sophisticated. The only way to succeed is to find ways of speaking to the audience in a way that engages them. And how we do that without lowering ourselves to kind of tabloid, yellow, journalism, it's a challenge, but it's an interesting challenge. And I think, I think there are incredible things happening in some unexpected places in journalism. I think in the US, the climate is really, really interesting. I think Trump has made journalism great again in the US. The nonprofit sector is booming. The subscriptions are up. So, and I think a lot of, much less on not on such big scale, but there's some very interesting initiatives happening in Europe, unfortunately less so everywhere else. But I think in Russia, there have been some very, very interesting, the digital media has brought some really interesting initiatives as well. So overall, I mean, journalists have always existed. So I don't think it's an existential crisis, but I think many will not survive it, and that may not be a bad thing.
Ooh, that's a very provocative way of ending that. We may not survive it, but that may not be a bad thing.
Some will not survive.
Some will not survive. Ivo, that sounds like a good segue to ask you.
Well, it's an interesting way to frame the question about disruption.
Ivo, could you turn on your mic?
Sorry.
And if you could turn, Natalia, if you could turn off.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's an interesting way to frame a question about disruption. And if we look at Jean-Paul Sartre and his existentialism and determinism essay, we know on the last page he tells us no man is an island. And it's exactly what's happened to journalism. They can't live on their own. They have to live not by talking to the audience, which my colleague just mentioned, by talking with the audience. And I think what's happened is that the bull is out of the gate. We now have citizens who are uploading 500 hours of footage every minute. And social media is there for us to use, as my colleague uses it effectively there. But they're also ready to produce their own stories, to make their own stories. So what we need is we need a model, we need new models for working with citizens in a different way, in a way that's more meaningful, I think, and going beyond just what they're telling us. Everybody's telling us our role needs to shift and we need to now include verification as part of our roles. Well, that's that's a given. What we need to do is to work out other ways of working with citizens. And I'd just like to wade in on fake news. It has been there forever. I mean, if we look at the films of Leni Riefenstahl, and we have to kind of just look way back then, and the films she made about the Nazis, and we have to ask our questions, what was that? Was that propaganda? Was that fake news? And is propaganda fake news? You can go a little closer. We just had an election in Australia, and all of the polls that we use, all of the polls predicted that a particular party would win. They didn't win. Right, and journalists used that information from the polls in their stories. So are they actually pandering? Are they actually selling fake news? I mean, these are really important questions. And but you know, my view is that the bull has bolted. The gates are open. We need to find ways of working with citizens, and that's our future, to work together, not to predict to. That's it.
Thank you. Boguslaw, I'd like to hear, as somebody who actually, moved into print journalism and helped set up a station, what's the, how do you see it? Where's the future for journalism?
As it's true, I spent almost 20 years working for television, so I did everything in television: programming, anchoring, lecturing, everything. This my very deep heritage. But just coming to the question of media, if it's evolution or revolution today, how much reality, digital reality changes media. I think media are the constant change. There's a constant evolution of methods of communication. But what about journalism? That's another question, because I think that journalists are challenging a great change today. I mean, traditional journalists, we are surrounded by invasion of semi-journalists, people who make copy-paste, people who are just delivering maybe not fake news, but not proven news in socials. It's a lot of such information today in internet. So the question for me is how to save premium journalism, how to save the sense of our jobs. And in fact, I have such an experience in my life, because I came to the very premium newspaper dying 6 years ago. They asked me to make reform, how to find it in a new digital environment. So I did a complete revolution. We started a strategy digital first. Means that there is no other teams for digital and for print. It's a unified team. And all texts are put online first. And the newspaper is a collection of stories from online, from time to time modified, seriously modified. But our commentary, our analysis comes in the internet first. So everyone in the team, even old guys, had to familiarize with these new digital techniques. Another request from myself, order, was to be very much multimedia. We have a studio in newspaper, we have some TV crews working, And majority of the team must appear on screen too. So they had to train voices. And the end of this revolution is a success story because the dying newspaper is, in a common opinion, #1 today in Poland, in a sense of quality. We are open for public debate. And the increase of online activities is 25 to 30% annually. So, okay, of course, we are losing print circulation still, but the company becomes profitable year by year much more. So it's possible to work in such a difficult environment, protecting premium journalism, but it needs some new skills.
Mikhail?
My question is not to be or not to be, but to speak Russian or English. I guess the majority of the audience prefers me to speak Russian.
Please, whatever. Both languages.
Okay. Я потрясен тем, что я сейчас услышал.
I'm just amazed by what I just heard. The fact that my colleagues believe that everything is okay, it somewhat reminds me a conversation on Titanic. Are we going through a crisis or just problems? It's not just a crisis, a revolution took place, and I'm shocked that, first of all, we're discussing how it is perceived from a journalist perspective. I think it's important to discuss what it should be from the perspective of the audience. A psychological revolution took place with the audience. No needing journalists anymore. We live in the age of economy of attention, where every person is a journalist. The place of journalism, instead of journalism that used to exist before, there's production of content. In the previous years, when I worked in a print newspaper, then a print magazine, then on television, journalists, the people who had the monopoly to produce content related to news, had the impression that they know how to generate content. The content is generated in an old analog, traditional way, the way it was done decades ago. Everything had changed now. The audience, thanks to these devices, look at the world in a completely different way. A mobile phone is every person's soul inside out. New generation of people who are born with mobile phones perceive any information in a different way. In the age of economy attention, every newspaper, every news outlet does not compete with others. It competes with HBO and Game of Thrones, or English Premier League, and Pornhub, and everything else, with all the other content producers. And I think ignoring that a colossal psychological revolution had just taken place with the audience is actually leading us down. We all, as generators of content, compete with everyone, with every person who's got social media account, every person who makes anything with their phone. And it's not only copy-paste, it's not only fake news, it's not only something extremely low quality and some sort of a hello from the Stone Age. No, these are the people of new generation who don't watch old TV, who don't read traditional news resources. They got ideas. They got amazing ideas that will make us shake in the nearest decade. And this is not the first psychological revolution caused by technologies in our memory. Remember when television appeared? More or less the same happened before, where all the previous journalism went to the past. Now conventional media are basically dying, and I think we'll have to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Okay, that was okay.
И тишина.
And silence.
Была минута молчания по
It was
традиционным медиа.
a minute of silence in memory of conventional media. Thank you.
You,
Natalia?
I completely agree on the economy of attention and that we're all competing with each other and so on. But I think it's totally misleading to say that the traditional media is dead. It's not. I mean, look at the New York Times subscription rates. Look at the data on, especially on the Western. There are a lot of media organizations, and a lot of them with the traditional sort of support structures and so on, who are doing extremely well. So I think the bar is higher. I think the bar, which is where I think it's really important to start thinking harder about the audience, because, you know, I mean, I think Australia example is really great that you brought, and I think it's repeated again and again when we as journalists have become very complacent in the way that we cover our societies. And there are enormous problems within the industry where, you know, it's the jobs are underpaid, so only certain people get them, and, you know, there are a lot of people are underrepresented. It's not a very representative industry. It's not very representative of the society, and so on and on. But it's not. You know, we need to get off this. What's happening is that I think it's forcing journalists to get off the high horse that we have been on for decades and think harder about how we can serve their audiences. Because another thing that you said, that while I agree with you that it is a competition for attention among all content producers, I think it's wrong to say that journalists are no longer needed, and it's not just my wishful thinking. I think there is real, you know, there are stats for, you know, the young people are actually looking at the news possibly more than the previous generations. And, you know, there is hunger because of the abundance of information. I think there is more appetite for something that you know you can trust. The problem is that a lot of people simply don't trust the media, but that's up to us to gain that trust back.
So,
Let me briefly answer. I was saying that journalists have turned into content producers. New York Times has been long time not a newspaper called New York Times. New York Times turned into a media studio. It's something in between Walt Disney and HBO that generate tremendous selection of all sorts of content. It's not journalism. Journalists, in the way they used to work before, can no longer work the old ways. They have to learn completely different set of skills. Natalia and I know each other for a long time. 10 years ago, Natalia was doing a completely different job, and I think you would agree. You had a completely different profession. You fully changed the profession in a decade. You stopped being a journalist.
Because the company that I worked for, I felt was incapable of doing the kind of journalism that's needed. Which is why I did it.
So,
which is what
okay, wait. So I'm going to go to Boguslaw, then I'm going to go to Zahera, and then Alex.
I love such simple explanations that revolution, ideology of mass media, everybody is this producer and the audience, etc., etc. But it's where you come to the figures, to money, to businesses, it's much more serious. And thank God, all youngsters turn to be adults one day. And I have myself very high-profile newspaper, and believe me, I need very good professional journalism to work on business issues, legal issues, politics, international politics, etc. And it's not a space for youngsters sending messages in internet. These are really needs. The guy should have knowledge, have instruments, etc. And thank God I have a return. Because there are people, maybe these are not millions, but hundreds of thousands, who use the media I produce, who are expecting premium knowledge from my newspaper. Also online, of course, online too. So it's a way for us to survive as journalists.
Zahera?
Okay, I have to disagree with Michael and agree with Natalia, but I just want to say that Reuters Institute issued a study recently, and that study showed that trust among audiences in what we now call traditional media is actually going up again. and trust in social media is going down because of the wave of disinformation that has been used, because of how these new platforms are being manipulated by political elite for their own interest. And also the idea that journalists are content producers. I teach journalism. It's so easy. We shifted into teaching our students how to be multimedia journalists. Teaching skills is not difficult. What difficult is to make sure that these young journalists of the future are aware of their role as journalists, are aware of their journalism, professionalism, are aware of the core principles of how to produce better, good journalism. I think that's the challenge that we face. Skills and technology is not a challenge. We can adopt, and we can adapt, and we have adapted through centuries. And you mentioned that, Michael. I think the challenge is more in how to produce, how to make sure that we are looking after the young generation of journalists into becoming good and better journalists.
Okay. Alexander?
Two clarification questions. You said with the arrival of television, journalism died. What kind of journalism you think died when television arrived? I just don't know the answer to this. Ask all your questions away. Now, well, let's do it one by one. Well, look, I can talk for a long time as how the world changed in the 60s when television arrived. In 1960s of the previous century, the very system of values has changed in which humanity lives, specifically because of the reason that television came in mass. All values changed. For instance, with the arrival of television, the global attitudes to war have changed. While before people believed that dying in the war is a brave thing to do. With reports from Vietnam, the value changed. People start thinking that dying in the war is stupidity and a result of brainwashing. The attitudes changed to sex, to religion, to basically all those institutions that existed globally before the arrival of television. They fell apart. Only the introduction of one technology had fully changed the world we live in. That's what I'm talking about. I think it's quite important to look at the world not from a tower we call journalism, but we should look at it also from the perspective of the audience. The people who used to call themselves journalists before 1960s and people who started calling themselves journalists after that have been doing things different in principle. The word stayed. The word is still around. Don't worry about the word. There will still be people who call themselves journalists, but they just do something completely different. And if Rzeczpospolita, a newspaper, had managed to transform itself into almost a movie company, that's great. But I'm very much in doubt about the word survive. If the problem is in survival, I think it talks about a problem. If you say that you have a wonderful success story, I absolutely agree with you that television did really change the world in the past century, but it didn't bury journalism that existed before. For journalism is objectivity, journalism is being fast, journalism is the response of the society to events and notions in the society, but the principles of journalism remain unchanged. You said that traditional journalists, professionals are not in demand, but let's look at Russian telegram channel called MASH. That is almost the main source of information in new platforms. But who does it? Professional journalists, those who used to work at live news. So I think social networks, yes, there are a lot of people with mobile phones that can post something in social media, but when we talk about professional journalism and the consumers of that professional journalism, we prefer for the news to be checked, objective, thorough, with a wide range of opinions, it's never going anywhere. And you said that we're on Titanic. No, we're not on Titanic. We're actually crawling somewhere uphill where new horizons are opening up, but we're definitely not diving.
1 second, Mikhail, before you respond, I want Ivo to get in on it.
I just wanted to repeat the professional journalists who worked on live news, and you were talking about objectivity and accuracy. That's just an oxymoron.
Okay, Ivo?
Look, not much to say that hasn't been said a couple of times, but maybe what I'll say is that the Reuters survey also said that 40% of all videos are watched on mobiles. It also said that mobile, which was the disruptor back in 2008, 9, 10, and 11, is now journalism's best friend and is also the best friend of revenue in journalism. That actually mobile is bringing revenue back into journalism because it's the anytime, anywhere. People are prepared to pay for subscriptions if they can get their news when and where they want it. And so my colleague over there said, Michael, I think, said that old TV is dead. Well, I used to make old TV. I made it for 30 years. I can tell you that old TV is dead, but nobody cares about old TV. We never did. What we care about is the content on TV. And we should actually talk about, that's what journalism is about. It's about content. So the skills of old TV, and we call that neo-journalism, are still relevant today when they're wrapped around new social media and mobile. So old TV might be dead or dying, but you know, don't forget, it was the millennials, it was the young people, my students actually, who invented the term binging. And they love to watch things. They love to watch good stories. So they still like to watch good content that's well made. And that's what I think we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about how we do our jobs properly, how we get young people involved in this mindset to be able to do their jobs properly.
Okay, so I'd like to get to two questions that, I mean, we've addressed a lot of issues, but we haven't been able to get deep into one. One of them is the revenue issue, and one of them is how to save long-form journalism, how to save the kind of deep investigative pieces that don't lend themselves to the digital media world right now. So the first one on revenue, Natalia, I'd like to start with you. When I was at Al Jazeera America, I was editor-in-chief, and we had the challenge of covering the American presidential elections. And me and all my senior reporters agreed that we would give all of the candidates equal airtime. But my ratings people, and Al Jazeera America, unlike Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera America was built as a normal business model, or was intended to be a normal business model until it shut down. But we had the choice of covering the candidates based on the audience reaction, or we had the choice of covering all of them with equal airtime. But my ratings people could show me that anytime we covered Donald Trump as a celebrity, the ratings went up, and the ratings would stay up. And then the second that you went off of Donald Trump, the ratings would collapse. So the senior executive at CBS bragged that Trump was the best thing that ever happened to CBS, that he saved CBS. And Trump himself noted that he feels that he deserves credit for having saved the media outlets because they, by covering him, increased their subscription base, increased the coverage in the same way that you would cover a car crash, in the same way that you would cover a war zone. That the spectacle of a celebrity drove audience share. And that's because of the revenue model. So, I mean, in a way, I think it argues to what Mikhail is arguing about how do you balance the need to bring in revenue as opposed to serve the public interest?
Well, if I had an answer to that question, I wouldn't be sitting here, would I? But look, I think if of all the things that the digital age can kill, and I hope will kill, is the 24-hour news cycle. Because I think the worst thing that has happened to journalism with television and cable news and then the internet that just accelerated it is the 24-hour news cycle. Because news just doesn't happen 24 hours a day. And I think to this day, I think the biggest producer of fake news and misunderstanding is not the Kremlin or not, I don't know, kids in Montenegro putting out, pro-Trump or pro-someone propaganda, but it is the very structure of the news industry as we know it. And there is a distinction between the news industry and the journalism. So in some way, I mean, I'm almost jumping to your second question without answering, but it relates to the revenue model. I don't think long-form investigative journalism really needs saving. I think there is a lot of it there. There's more of it now than there has ever been, arguably. And I think some of it, and I think it needs to get better in, sort of packaging the stories that they do. I think, investigative journalists need to get better at explaining to people why stories that they do matter. And ultimately, I personally am of the school of thought that at the end of the day, journalism is a public service, and it's very hard to get away from it. And if you are, chasing the rankings and chasing the online advertisement, you're bound to be producing stuff that's for eyeballs. I think my hope, when it comes to revenue, look, everyone, I don't think there will ever be a universal solution to it, but I can see that the landscape is changing, and there are a lot of media companies, especially in the US, where there is more money for journalism, that are coming up and where there is a culture of giving. There are a lot of people and a lot of news organizations that are coming up with incredibly creative ways of funding their content. You look at someone like Vox that is, it is a for-profit company, but they're not chasing the sort of profits that, BuzzFeed was chasing when they came up with the, click-based kind of that entire advertisement-driven system, which failed them. Like it didn't, BuzzFeed is there and it's doing some really good journalism, but ultimately they're not making the kind of money that they promised their investors. So, but, and it brings us to another problem. To be and not to be I think it's a slightly pointless question to ask, and it's a question that can apply to anything. It can apply to our societies at large. We don't know it. It's not just journalism that's changing with the digital world. The very texture of our societies are changing. So like everything is changing. And I think there won't be a universal solution, but I think there are a lot of people that are coming up with a lot of creative ways of monetizing membership I'm constantly, Coda, my company is part of the Institute for Nonprofit News in the US, and it's incredible to see this like small startups in Alabama or Mississippi that are finding sustainability in monetizing their membership and their audiences, and building the relationship with their audiences where, the audience supports them. And that never really happened in journalism before. So that's why I'm not that, I think it will mean death for a lot of content producers, and of course, and a lot of news organizations that cannot innovate, that cannot redefine their relationships and so on. But I think, hopefully, the good ones will survive, because I do think that the need for them will be there because of the abundance of information and not because of the lack of it.
Thanks. Ivo?
Just to pick up on that, the New York Times subscription numbers have gone very high. They aren't making any money yet, and that's the key, but the numbers are there, which is a good sign, because people want the stuff behind the paywall. They want to be able to buy good journalism. But I think the revenue question is very interesting, and I think one of the answers for that, and I also don't have any answers, is looking at alternative revenue sources. If you look at OCCRP, the Organised Crime Corruption Reporting Program, I think investigative journalists, my friends that work in investigative journalism, say it's doing very well at the moment. And they are funded by USAID and other people. And I think you need to just look outside, like we are actually working with citizens in other ways now. We're working across platforms in various ways. We need to look outside of the traditional model of providing, to raise the revenue and the funding. But it doesn't mean that the quality of journalism needs to drop. The OCCRP do some of the most amazing work. They just do it differently and they have a different funding source.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the audience, and so if you would raise your hand and if the mics would be brought to you, we'll start right there with the woman there. Thank you. No, it's not on yet.
Thank you. Joanna Lilis, I'm the Kazakhstan correspondent for Eurasianet and a contributor to The Economist. Thank you. Your discussion today is about digital reality of mass media. Well, I don't know if you're aware, but the digital reality of the media and for the media in Kazakhstan is that the authorities regularly block access to news sites if they try to cover topics that are that the authorities don't wish them to cover, and also that when occurrences happen that the authorities do not wish to reach the public, such as public protests, the internet is blocked en masse, that 3G and 4G coverage is disrupted, and also that every evening in Kazakhstan you may have noticed that the internet regularly crawls along or completely grinds to a halt because it's being disrupted for political reasons. So my question is, how appropriate is it to hold a conference on the media in Kazakhstan without discussing this, without raising this, and what is the panelists' take on that? Or indeed, how appropriate is it indeed to hold a conference on such a thing on the media in Kazakhstan at all? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Let's get the panelists' response.
Если можно, я начну как представитель России, в которой недавно был принят закон о суверенном интернете, и это тоже вопрос, который имеет прямое отношение к тому, о чем вы сказали. Это все, с одной стороны, это чудовищно контрпродуктивно. И то, и другое, блокировка интернета, любые ограничения интернета, это неосознанные, а может быть осознанные помехи, которые власти государств создают для развития, для собственного развития и для развития общества. В России так вышло. Интернет является единственной средой, где существует устойчивое и очень бурное развитие. Все традиционные медиа в России уничтожены по политическим причинам в течение последних 10 лет, зато онлайн существует колоссальное разнообразие, качественный контент, и это единственное пространство, где по-прежнему все более чем неплохо. Поэтому любые ограничения интернета в России, конечно же, будет самым главным ударом по будущему России и по будущему российского общества. Я думаю, что то, что происходит в Казахстане, это ошибка. Осознанная или неосознанная. И, конечно же, с одной стороны, мы видим, что проведение конференций и обсуждение важных вопросов – это попытка, с одной стороны, развивать и казахстанские медиа, и казахстанское общество, но если параллельно с этим наносятся удары по этим самым медиа и этому самому обществу, это просто, видимо, проявление близорукого подхода, ошибочного подхода, который, конечно, очень сильно навредит. Закрыть интернет, я уверен, невозможно, потому что так или иначе любые запретительные меры всегда сильно технологически отстают от любых попыток обойти эти запреты. К счастью, те люди, которые моложе, они, как правило, технологически более развиты и хитры.
Alexander, would you like to comment?
Ну, моя компания не занимается производством журналистского контента, скажем так. Мы занимаемся развлекательным контентом, поэтому нас это не очень касается. Но есть же VPN. Вот у меня вопрос. Все знают, что такое VPN. Неужели нельзя воспользоваться VPN? Насколько вообще то, что вы говорите, отключение, блокировка интернета, там, YouTube могут повлиять? Ну, кто хочет зайти, тот всегда зайдет. В чем проблема?
I don't think VPN is the point, really. I think we're sitting here talking about independent media and the development of independent media to a room where we have a lot of Kazakh journalists. And a lot of what we talk about doesn't apply. And Joanna, thank you for your question, because I think you're right. And to be honest, I thought long and hard whether I wanted to be part of it. And I was hoping that there would be a Kazakh journalist here, maybe, who would be able to talk about the situation in Kazakhstan with the political freedom, with the freedom of media, and so on. It is, yes, I mean, the sad thing about it is that a lot of the lessons that are being learned, and a lot of the, you know, that future and the existential crisis that we're discussing, it doesn't apply, not just in Kazakhstan, but across the post-Soviet space, because, you know, unlike Russia, where there is actually a really interesting, you know, vibrant online media culture, in much of Central Asia, there simply isn't. And, you know, it would be great if, you know, conversations like this became a push towards changing that. I mean, having, you know, lived in Kazakhstan 10 years ago and having been to this forum, I haven't seen many signs of that, unfortunately. But I think it's a very, very important question, and I'm really glad that it was asked.
Boguslaw, would you like to say something?
We know what's the reality about politics here. Well, we are not ignorant, as you know, about it. But it's a fundamental question. Why are we coming here? Because we want to share with our experience, want to present new technology, want to educate simply some people, because the time flows. So maybe in the future, not only a session like this will be open for this society. I see no censors here. We can speak openly, yeah? And I believe there's a future also for this society. So it's good time to start it up and make a pressure on. Yeah? And I will share with you a very short story. I was coming to my colleagues in New York Times and Washington Post a couple of months ago. We were speaking about convergence, and they were speaking about a kind of a Trump effect. You know what is the Trump effect in the Washington Post and New York Times? The growing number of digital subscriptions. It was the turning point, because they were so much critical for Trump that they found an audience of these people who are willing to read about it, all these critical stories. And that's also the reason that I'm still alive. My newspaper and Gazeta Wyborcza and all Polish independent press, we are very much critical for government. They read us every day, very carefully, what we write. No? So from the point of view of the system of democracy, advanced democracy, premium, independent, serious, responsible press is still very much important. You can put on Facebook anything you want, but it will never reach, I mean, minds of people who are responsible for the country. So this is a deep sense of my presence in media and in here.
Thank you. Zahera?
Just briefly, I have to say that it's an important question, and as Bogo said, we are all aware of the political realities, but we in the Ethical Journalism Network, which is an international consortium of journalists, we believe in the need to engage with journalists across the board, with journalists that lives the difficult conditions, journalists that are free and journalists who are not free. We need to engage in a discussion. We need to engage and talk to each other. If we just stay away, that will not help us and will not help us as an international community of journalists in order to advance our profession and do good to our societies.
Thank you. We have a question in the back. Your mic's not on.
Good afternoon. I have a question to Mikhail, first of all, and Alexander, as well as Boguslaw, and most likely Natalia will assist with answering this question. The question, are we accepting this challenge? For many of the journalists, it's a question about whether to compromise with the owners of the media. In Kazakhstan and in Russia, many media are quasi-governmental or they're owned by oligarchs, and you are aware of this story when the whole political section of the Kommersant newspaper left in Moscow. And what is your opinion? How can journalists find trade-offs, compromise with the shareholders, with the state or the oligarchs? And if we are to leave, then what kind of platforms are we supposed to be using? Thank you. Well, if you allow me, I will start, because I worked for the Kommersant newspaper for about 10 years, and I know personally all the individuals who left. I left Kommersant 10 years ago, in 2008, because I understood, it was clear to me that it looked like everything was over. I personally believed that I was not able to work for that newspaper anymore, which used to be the best newspaper in Russia. Many of my colleagues within the last 10 years decided to quit due to multiple different reasons. I think that, unfortunately, they believe that there are no new ideas, there is no life, and the level of pressure is unmeasurably high. Many journalists who stayed and continued to work didn't do anything shameful. Almost all of them who recently left, evidently and very exactly, are very honest people. But did they have to tolerate all of that, watching the newspaper not covering some most important and pressing issues? Yeah, they were probably tolerating that. On the one hand, I'm happy that they've done an important human choice. They decided not to put up with it anymore. I think it's a dilemma not just for a journalist, it's a dilemma for any individual, whether he or she is ready to go through this sense of discomfort for the sake of some visible, tangible goods. That's a generalized question that many people in many countries in different professions ask themselves. There is no universal recipe. There is a traditional way out for journalists. Thanks God, we have lots of... In Russia, if you work as an independent journalist, you are not risking your life, you're risking to lose your job. Almost all of the qualitative journalists lost their work within the last 10 years, 90% of them. Many of them are still in journalism as freelancers because, fortunately, the technologies enable them to do so. The new kind of journalism, as different from the previous one, provides lots of opportunities. Many people changed their profession in a very radical way, but they keep fulfilling their mission, and that's possible. Alexander? I would fully agree with Mikhail here, because the new digital technologies that are now going through this stage of dynamic development, messengers, that's probably a way for the journalists who do not want to put up with the oligarchs. And, for instance, the new product that was launched by the former stars of NTV. That's a very good product that is a pleasure to watch. We can create our multimedia, but we don't need to put many millions into buying buildings and equipment. You have your brain professionalism, you have your mobile phone, and you are your own mass medium. It's cool.
I know that there are some countries, not so far, that there is a way of keeping calm journalists, even killing them. And it's a very risky job, I know. That's why I honor very much independent journalists from Russia, very, very high. In my country, thank God, there is no such a tradition. being independent journalism, it's not very risky. I don't remember any case of special oppression for such people. And from the other hand, we have another protection. We have investors from the West. I mean, investors from America, from Germany, etc., who are shareholders of our media companies. And it's very difficult to play a game with the big actors. Now we have a very populistic government that controls public radio and television. This is pure Stalinist propaganda, what we do. But it's good for us, because we are in a contrary position. We have our readers, and we have loyal readers, because they can imagine, these readers, what can happen in the case that everything is under control of government. So in my everyday operations, activities, I have no question about how to live with government. Because if they do something good, this is rare. I accept and we comment in the right way, positively. If they are spoiling society, economy, or something that they do almost every day, I have the right to criticize. So that's the way we do.
Thank you. Zahera, you wanted to say something?
I just want to just make one comment, because it's been mentioned, and I think it's important to highlight the fact that we need to look beyond what we're discussing today, the digital reality of journalism, and speak about one of the main challenges that journalists in authoritarian and undemocratic regimes are struggling with, which is safety. I've just been to Egypt recently, and I've written a paper on the fact that in Egypt, journalists don't really, they adapt with the technologies and social media, whatever. But one of the main problems they are facing is to stay alive and not to disappear, and to be able to do their job without the fear of disappearance. Because there are so many cases in Egypt now where journalists suddenly disappear and no one knows where they are, for the fact of writing something on social media or publishing something through their own blogs and websites, and that thing is against the status quo, which leads to them being physically attacked.
Thank you. Natalia, did you want to say anything?
I think very connected to this point. I mean, I've had a luxury all my life to have never faced that dilemma of whether I need to leave or not because of pressure or the pressure that I put on myself. But I think one thing that we haven't touched on at all that is very important when we speak both about the future of media generally and about future of media in countries like Kazakhstan are the social media networks and the role that they play. Because I think one of the biggest challenges that faces journalism in general is the distribution. The distribution systems are also broken. Our direct relationship with a lot of our audiences is broken because we all go through social media companies. And it's the social media companies who our governments don't know how to regulate, and undemocratic governments have learned how to manipulate. The pressure needs to be on them to somehow not to allow the collapse of not just journalism, but of societies in general. So, we can all take to Facebook and start publishing, but, to escape our own authoritarian reality, but what will Facebook do, and how many people will see that? And that is a dilemma that journalists have faced from across the world. Look at the Philippines, look at the Cambodia, like so many countries in Central Asia. And I think that's something that the conversation that needs to be constantly pushed in the West as well, because the pressure on the companies has to come from Western journalists. And the thing for Western journalists to remember is the responsibility they have to the journalists whose primarily concern is their safety and for whom these social networks are a lifeline.
Actually, the solidarity of journalists with each other across, I know that when I was with Al Jazeera, the number of reporters, of course, that we've had arrested in countries or disappeared, the greatest help that we had was journalists from across the world, from outlets everywhere else standing together in solidarity. I think that's one of the strongest tools journalists have. There's a question way in the back.
My name is Ayjan, is from Sir Media. My question for Ivo Burum, Zahera Harb. Let's talk about newspapers, future newspaper reporters. Time with time, the problem of newspaper workers will be more difficult. Newspapers are dying. You agree that you understand me?
So what is the question?
So you were at,
Do you agree that newspapers are dying?
and how do we? Well, I mean, more than just do you agree, but what to do about it, I think, is the question.
I think the question's what to do about it.
Right.
Yeah, look, we still have newspapers in Australia, and I still read them on Saturday morning because I like to fill out the crossword and do that stuff. But I think the question's about what are we doing for journalists and with journalists who are print journalists. I work a lot with print journalists, training print journalists across the epistemic divide, and actually getting them to work in a digital sphere. And I'm surprised always at how many how many media organisations there still are where with journalists who are still having issues getting across and using mobile for more than just internet, scouring the internet and sending emails. And I think the thing that I do the most of is I work with journalists, print journalists, training them to use mobiles to tell stories. And the biggest problem that they have is that they're actually being asked to do more. And what's really interesting is we're finding that there's a whole bunch of these. The young journalists don't want to do it because they want their Cecil B. DeMille moments. They want the big cameras. The older journalists are waiting for retirement, and it's the ones in the middle who have who have to find dollars for their families that are actually really involved. I work extensively with journalists from Syria and Yemen and Egypt and a whole lot of other places in the Middle East. And I think that the biggest question we have is what digital skills are relevant for them. And that's kind of, I think, how you stay employed. And whether that keeps print journalism alive, I don't know what print journalism is anymore. Is that a paper or is that print online? I don't know what that is. Are we talking about keeping a broadsheet alive? What are we talking about? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'll start with the idea of print journalism because now we're discussing, and I think other schools of journalism around the globe have already done something about it. We're discussing the idea of actually looking for a different name for it, because what we're doing now is we're training our students, and I also train journalists across the globe to become multimedia journalists and actually use online platforms, online news platforms, and the skills of being a professional journalist is the same, but we're teaching them the new technological skills. So it's not enough anymore for a journalist to be able to write. They should be able to write, they should be able to record, and they should be able to shoot and edit within the three kind of domains. The other thing that I want to say is newspapers are still alive, and in Britain we have a very, very successful example of that. The Guardian has managed, and they announced recently that they have actually, they didn't make profit, but they are, balanced, that the balance sheet is okay, and they have started, I think 3 years ago, a new business model like crowdfunding. So they are asking the public to pay into keeping the newspaper alive. And it happened, and they are alive, and they are producing one of the best investigative stories. And they are also giving space for international news, and they are working in the public interest. So they are not following ratings and revenues as such, but they are producing good journalism, and that good journalism is funded by the public.
Ivo and then Boguslaw.
Just to finish off, we are teaching them multimedia skills. That's what we do a lot of, absolutely. But I'm finding that fundamental to all this are the writing skills. And we have this saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it's a form of neo-journalism. It's about taking, and I understand, Mikhail, exactly what he's saying, but it's about taking those skills that are still relevant today and wrapping them somehow around the new technology. Two things happen. One is that young journalists learn how to make stuff that's interesting, that people will watch, and they make it in a slightly different way, but it has all the fundamentals of good journalism. The other thing is that they'll probably get a job somewhere because they'll sell their story. Because the truth that I've learned after 30 years in TV is that everybody will buy a good story.
Boguslaw?
There is no brave person to answer the question how long the paper will exist. But I want to point out three things. First, that print media doesn't need print. We can make good print media online. Even more, there were some good media based on the concept of print that started up in online. Huffington Post, it's a case. It's a good weekly in the concept. Yeah, so it is possible. It is possible, I think.
So, guys, sorry, we're going to have to wrap up, but what I wanted to do is give each of you an opportunity to make final statements. I'm going to ask you to keep it to about 1 minute, but I'm going to ask that you concentrate on giving your recommendations to the audience on what you think we should all be doing. There are a lot of journalists in the room. There are a lot of aspiring journalists who are watching or in the room. What do you think we should be concentrating on? If you have a really pessimistic outlook, maybe you have, what are the optimistic suggestions maybe that you might have? And for everybody who's outlined a problem, what are the solutions that you might think are good? And this time I'm going to start on this side with Mikhail.
I think that I have the most optimistic approach comparing to my colleagues. For my colleagues are wondering, suffering, thinking because of the problem. I think we shouldn't worry. There are new opportunities in this new life. Just we shouldn't try and hold on to the past. I think the new technological life gives us a great number of opportunities. People earlier spoke of disinformation, fake news. Very often they say post-truth. I think all of this is wonderful. Fake news did exist at all times. Post-truth is the age after the newspaper Pravda, which is the Russian word for the truth. When one media had monopoly for lies, or one journalist shop had monopoly for lie. Now, no one has that monopoly. That means everyone has a great number of opportunities to find the truth. The number of sources of information had multiplied so dramatically that this definitely makes life easier. We know we're being lied to, but we do have a tremendous number of ways of finding the information, finding the original sources, Googling. And we have endlessly more opportunities to really dig to the truth. And I do think that all these new horizons opening up now should be used. This is a happiness to any man who wants to generate content in a one day. Today, individual with the help of Google gets to learn more than Middle Ages individual could learn in their lifetime. I think this opportunity exists and we should use it.
Alexander?
Well, I again show solidarity with Mikhail. For journalism, I believe, only flourishes from stress. And today, there are more stress for journalists because, on the one hand, internet gets blocked down, oligarchs, owners are not liked by everyone. A lot of excuses can be found to not do anything, but professionals only grow stronger from such stress. And given today's digital opportunities, I think it's a golden age of journalism to become stronger, to become more professional. Most importantly, don't be lazy and move forward, and everything is going to be great then.
Thank you. Zahera?
Coming from Ethical Journalism Network, I have to say that we as journalists need to keep close eye and focus on our core standards as journalists. and on our core professional standards. One of the issues that has been raised recently is the issue of hate speech. And I was working with a group of journalists from the Caribbean in August, and one of the things that we established is journalists need to be aware not to help in disseminating hate speech, and that fake news, between brackets, disinformation, actually generate hate speech. So I need to be sure that I am accurate, I verify everything, I don't rush to publish and broadcast just because I need to follow the ratings or the revenue, because it's more important to keep your integrity safe by not disseminating inaccurate and disinformation through any platform.
Natalia?
So I remember a few years ago, BBC advertised for a job, which was a digital diplomatic correspondent, and at the time I found it hilarious, and I still do, as opposed to analog diplomatic correspondent. I think it's I think all media will be digital and is already pretty much digital, and I think it's just going to be journalism, and it will be slightly different than from what we know, but it doesn't change the basics of it and the basic purposes that it serves. I do think that the people have an insatiable appetite for a good story, and as long as we as journalists can wrap the important information and good reporting and good journalism into a good story, I think we will find our audiences, and the industry will survive, as long as, of course, as the basics are in place, like freedom to report and publish and so on. And in the countries where the basics aren't in place, I mean, you asked for advice for the Kazakh journalists who are in the room, you know, I mean, the government in Kazakhstan over the last decades since the independence has learned many lessons from Russia. I think you guys should learn, ladies and gentlemen, should learn many lessons from the Russian journalists working in Russia, working in digital media in Russia, who've done some very innovative, very amazing work. So you should all talk to Mikhail afterwards.
Thank you. Ivo?
Yeah. I'll just be very brief.
Your mic, Ivo.
I think it's about the social contract. It's about helping our young journalists understand what that means, to have a social contract. I don't think democracy comes unless you are actually working at it. We talk about a global digital village, and what does that mean? That's a fragmented space that really needs a lot of work. Society needs work, and I think journalism is strong. It's going to be even stronger, and our young people are going to be working in a much more interesting world of journalism than I did and that we did. And once we help them understand what it is to have a social contract, not that they don't, I'm not being patronising, but in journalism that's really important. And I think training is really a key to this, and being receptive to what they tell us to amend our training is really important.
Thank you. And Boguslaw?
I think that new digital technology opened completely new spaces for human activities, also for journalists. But it's not a world apart. It's a new space, but it needs some regulations and rules. Also, I mean, rules like professional journalism. We know these rules in analog world, but the same rules should be transferred to digital. This is a human sphere, nothing more, like the real one. So stop piracy, think about authors' rights, protection of intellectual property. These are challenges for new digital world. And what about the message to local Kazakh journalists? I think that you should take care of digital, of online. That's the future for you, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the one question I didn't ask was about artificial intelligence, and the reason I didn't is because there's a fantastic panel coming up next with a fantastic group of panelists that's going to be talking about artificial intelligence, and maybe you'll ask questions about how that relates to journalism. Now, if you'll just join me in a round of applause for our fantastic panelists. Thank you.